Welcome back. So today we're going to be working on 7.4. So you're going to need these two handouts, so doodle notes, as well as the one that has properties, theorems, as well as corollaries on there. We're going to be starting with our doodle notes. So if you want to go ahead and take that one out first. We're going to be looking at rectangles first today. So we're going to talk about all the different things we know about a rectangle and what makes a rectangle and not just a parallelogram. So starting out, we have a rectangle it is a parallelogram. With all right angles. So something that makes this parallelogram different from others is that we have all right angles. So we're going to go ahead and mark those. Okay, and we're going to talk more about some of the parallelogram stuff down here in our bullet points. So let's move on down here to the next one. It says opposite sides. What do we know about the opposite sides for our rectangle? Well, since it's a parallelogram, we know opposite sides have to be congruent. And we know that they have to be parallel. So we're going to go ahead and mark those. So congruent, remember that's the little hash mark. Parallel, we use the little arrows. Little arrows, not too good on that side. All right, so we have congruent marked with two hash marks on these sides, one on these, and then parallel marked with one arrow on those opposite sides, two arrows on those opposite sides. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Now we're going to talk about the diagonals. If you remember when we talked about diagonals with our parallelograms, you can go ahead and draw these on here. We said that those diagonals bisect each other. So that is still true for our rectangle. But now we have some additional information that's specific to a rectangle. So diagonals bisect each other. And they are also congruent. So these two diagonals are exactly the same length. So since they are the same length, when we bisect them, the pieces are going to be the same length. So we're actually going to mark all of these with three little hash marks showing that all four of those pieces are congruent to each other. Okay. All right, that is all that we have for the rectangle. Now we're going to move on to a rhombus. So this is another kind of special parallelogram. So our rhombus here, we're going to start out over here on this side. So a rhombus is a parallelogram. This time it has all congruent sides. Okay, so you'll notice we don't have the right angles anymore, but we have all congruent sides. So we're going to go ahead and mark all of those. Okay, now we're going to come over here and talk about the opposite angles. Okay, so since it is a parallelogram, we know that those opposite angles are going to be congruent. We can go ahead and mark those. Those are congruent to each other. The next one is dealing with our opposite sides. So again, since this is a parallelogram, we know opposite sides are going to be congruent and parallel. Now we've already marked that all four of the sides are actually congruent, so we're just going to add the parallel piece here. opposite sides are parallel. Okay, then for the next one, we're looking at the diagonals again. So let's go ahead and draw our diagonals, kind of help us to see what's going on. So this time you'll notice our diagonals, they're still going to bisect each other because this is a parallelogram. But now they are also perpendicular to each other. So you'll notice here where they intersect, they create a right angle. So they are perpendicular as well. Okay, and then the last one we have with this one is talking about our consecutive angles. And again, since this is a parallelogram, those consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, that is the last one that I have for the rhombus. We're going to go ahead and move on to our third and final special for today, and that one is the square. So the square is one of the most precise names that we can give to a parallelogram. So we've got a lot of different things going on in this one. So let's start out over here with our square. So a square is a parallelogram with all four sides congruent. So similar to our rhombus in that all the sides are congruent. And it has all right angles. So then that's similar to our rectangle. Okay, so what's actually happening here with our square is we're taking everything we talked about with the rectangle and the rhombus, and we're smushing those together. Because in order for it to be a square, it actually has to be both of those other parallelograms. Okay, so we're going to come down here and we're going to go ahead and mark some pieces on here. So we've got four congruent sides. So we're going to go ahead and mark those. And we have all right angles, so let's go ahead and mark those. And then we'll come down to our bullet points here. Starting with those opposite sides, they are parallel and congruent, because remember, this is still a parallelogram, so those rules still apply. So they are parallel and congruent. And remember, we've already marked the congruency piece, so we just need to mark the parallel part. So using those little arrows again to show that those sides are parallel. Okay. The next one that we have is dealing with the diagonals. So again, we're going to go ahead and draw those diagonals on. Now, if we look at our diagonals, we'll see that they are bisecting each other. Because it's a parallelogram, we know those diagonals are going to bisect each other. And since this has to be a rectangle in order to be a square, we know that those diagonals are also congruent. And something that's actually not on here, but we also know about it since this is a rhombus, we also know that those diagonals are perpendicular. So we're just going to add that on there. Okay, so when we mark these, since it bisects and is congruent, we can mark all of these as being the exact same length. And then I'm going to put a little box here at the intersection because we know that those are also perpendicular. Okay. All right, that is all that I have for the doodle notes. So then we're going to go ahead and take out the properties sheet. So that's the one that looks like this. And we're going to be starting on the left-hand side with the theorems. Starting on the left-hand side there. Okay, so our first theorem that we have is dealing with the rhombus. So for the rhombus, it says a parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if the diagonals are perpendicular. Remember we said that was special for a rhombus, was that those diagonals are perpendicular. So diagonals are perpendicular. Okay, the next one that we have here, we're still dealing with a rhombus. This time it says a parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if each of these diagonals, and I know there's not a line there, but it's too much for me to write down here, so that's why I'm writing it up there. A parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if each diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. Okay, so we knew that they bisected each other, and we knew they were perpendicular here, but now something else that we're adding with this theorem is that here at angle B, it's also an angle bisector. It's not just a segment bisector, but it's cutting that angle into two congruent parts. Same thing here at A, C, and D. So if you want to go ahead and circle those angles, just to draw our attention to that it's cutting those angles into two congruent parts. Okay. The next one that we have is dealing with our rectangle. So a parallelogram is a rectangle if and only if its diagonals are congruent. Okay, those diagonals have to be congruent, and we talked about that on the doodle note sheet, that those diagonals needed to be congruent to each other, and that was something special with the rectangle. So I'm just going to highlight those diagonals to draw our attention to that. Those diagonals are going to be congruent. All right, let's move over to the left, or excuse me, to the right-hand side with our corollaries. All right, so our first corollary here is dealing with a rhombus. It says a quadrilateral is a rhombus if and only if it has four congruent sides. Remember we said those sides all had to be congruent? So that was something special with a rhombus. The next one is with a rectangle. So a quadrilateral is a rectangle if and only if it has four right angles. Right angles. Remember we said that was specific to our rectangle. We're going to circle those right angles. Okay, and then we're going to come down here and we're actually kind of putting both of these together here. A quadrilateral is a square if and only if it is a rhombus and a rectangle. Okay, so remember we talked about on the doodle notes that it has to be both of those in order to be able to be considered a square. All right, so all of those theorems, corollaries, properties that we've been talking about, if all of the rectangle and rhombus stuff applies, then we can call it a square. Okay, that is all that I have for you today. Have a great day. I will see you in class. Bye.